All right, welcome to my presentation on JHipster. My name is John Thompson. I run a website called Spring Framework Guru. Tell you a little bit about myself here to get started. Been doing this IT thing for about 25 years. I am currently a consultant with a company called LJP Technologies out of London. And even though they're out of London, I do work in the US. Quite a little journey to get here. I'm glad to be here in Poland. It's my first time. Definitely enjoying seeing a bit of Europe. I spent about 2 years as a Spring Source consultant. In 2013, I was a speaker at Spring One. Hopefully be speaking this year. They're still working through that. And I already mentioned I'm the founder of Spring Framework Guru. On the side, I'm a bit of a cyclist and a triathlete. I love cycling down to Key West. There's an annual charity ride that I do. It's 280 miles over 3 days. Done 2 Ironmans, and if training holds out right, I'll be doing a full Ironman in Cozumel this November. So a lot of people haven't even heard of what JHipster is. It's kind of hard to describe. It's an open source project that takes in Bootstrap CSS, AngularJS, and couples it with Spring Boot and all the goodness that comes with Spring. So it's a Yeoman generator which uses code generation to basically generate a lot of the boilerplate type code that you're going to be encountering. And it will build out HTML, JavaScript, and also the Java code. So Bootstrap, you must be living under a rock if you're not familiar with Bootstrap CSS. It's probably the most widely used CSS framework today. The second most popular on GitHub. And Bootstrap uses a mobile-first design, meaning that you have a reactive design and it adapts itself for different devices. I think this is like one of the things really driving its popularity. And then AngularJS, released in 2009, is now probably one of the most popular frameworks out there for using JavaScript. It is something that I'm using more and more in my work when I have to do front-end work. It does follow a nice MVC pattern and decouples things nicely. And then Spring Boot. Spring Boot has been out on the market for a few years now. It is something that was missing from the Spring framework for a long time. I remember the older days before Spring Boot, you had to wire up everything yourself. You're doing a lot of mundane tasks, bringing in components and wiring up components. Now Spring Boot will bring in sensible defaults for you, and it also offers in a lot of curated dependencies and also a lot of benefits when you're going in to production. One of the nice things that I like about it is that it does do these sensible defaults. A lot of times you're going to be developing against a H2 in-memory database, and just include that on your class path, and when Spring Boot sees it, it's automatically going to configure it for you. And then underneath it all, we have the Spring framework. Spring is the #1 framework being used for enterprise application development. It has a number of sub-projects, and JHipster leverages a lot of these. Obviously, Spring MVC for the web, Spring Data for database access, Spring Security for security, and we also get into some of the smaller projects like Spring Social to do social media logins and whatnot. So, setting up your JHipster development environment, you're going to need a number of components to bring in. Obviously, Java 1.8. You can do Gradle or Maven, or you do need to install Node.js, install Yeoman, and Bower. So these are all common tools that if you're coming from a Java development background, you're probably not used to using some of these things, especially Gulp. Then JHipster, very simple, npm install -g JHipster, or generator JHipster, I'm sorry. And then creating a JHipster project is very simple. You kick it off by using Yeoman, and it's JHipster is the command that you want to run. And you're going to get a screen that comes up that looks like this. And you're going to have a number of options to select from for JHipster. And I'm going to be focusing on creating a monolithic application. You do have options to create microservices within JHipster. For the purpose of this lecture, I'm going to be talking about creating a monolithic application. So going through the JHipster prompts, it's going to ask you type of project, the base name of your application, and this is important. This is going to be used a lot in how JHipster configures itself. And then your default package name, and this is going to be a base package name that JHipster is going to use to build upon. Then authentication, you do have several types of authentication, and underneath the covers we're going to be using Spring Security. And then it's going to prompt you to see if you want to use social, and again that's going to be using the integration with Spring Social and Spring Security. And then we're going to get into the databases, and obviously through Spring you're going to have a plethora of choices when it comes to database technology. I've primarily used the traditional SQL databases with JHipster. It does support Mongo and Cassandra, but when you get into those, you do see some limitations down the road. So it's going to ask you the database, it's going to ask you the production database, and it's also going to ask you the development database. So you could set up to run against MySQL in production and H2 in development, or Oracle in production and use H2 in development. The one thing I like to do when I'm working with this type of technology is to use an in-memory database. So you can set that up. Every time you start, you have a fresh database, a known set of data to work against. Then we have an option to use the Hibernate second level cache, either EH cache or distributed cache. Hazelcast is supported. We can also bring in a search engine using Elasticsearch. Clustered HTTP sessions through Hazelcast or WebSockets also. And these are all options that we can get into as we're setting up the project. Now you have an option of using Maven or Gradle for building the back end. I'm going to be demonstrating Maven for this. Gradle also works just as well. And the style sheet processor and internationalization. And then you have a number of testing frameworks that you can pull in optionally as well. So after you run the command, this is a little screenshot. It does take a few minutes to run as it pulls in all the dependencies. So that's why I'm stepping through it here. And I'm going to toggle over to IntelliJ and take a look at some of the things that get generated by JHipster. Now what I have here is an initial project created with JHipster. And we can see that we get a number of things created for us. And this is just vanilla. I went through the command prompts, and this is like the base project that's been created. And we can see that there's a number of classes. I'm going to start off in the domain. It does create a JPA class for users. Also authority, so this is just very base stuff that's generated. We also get into a number of configurations. So these are all Spring configuration classes that are wiring up Spring Boot, how we want it to work. It also sets up Ajax authentication. So this is all stuff that you normally have to do that you're not having to do using JHipster. I'm going to take a quick peek at the application that's generated. It's also generated AngularJS code for us. All the HTML code go with it. So you can see it in just the baseline project, JHipster's generated quite a bit for us. Now to run JHipster, one of the things that they've done, I'm going to demo just the baseline project here. One of the brilliant things that they've done is you're going to run two processes. First one down here, we're just going to run a Maven script, and this is going to start up Spring Boot. So you can see that Spring Boot has come up on 8080, and this is running basically the back end of our application. It's got an H2 database. It's configured everything for that. Now the next thing we want to do is run Gulp, and this is going to create a little web server for us, and it's going to focus on handling all the front-end assets. So Gulp automatically opens up the browser for us. And this is a kind of a difficult concept if you're used to just pure Java development, because it's always been, to me, kind of a unnatural act the way Java managed web resources. So now we have Spring Boot running basically in Tomcat, listening there, and then we have Gulp handling all the web resources, all the HTML, all the JavaScript, and it's going to watch those so it's browser sync. So when we make changes to those, it's automatically going to refresh the browser for us. And it's not serving those through Tomcat. So it's been problematic for Java developers where you change a file inside of a war, you have to redeploy it, and it's really kind of annoying, to be honest. This way, you have two independent processes. So Spring Boot's sitting there in the background, sitting over the databases, providing API access. But Gulp is actually running all the web resources. So you can see here, we got a couple of accounts coming right out of the gate. We have an administrator account and a user account. I'm going to come in and sign in with the admin account. And we do have a number of things here. So since we're an administrator, we can administer users. And then through Spring Boot, we're going to get metrics. So they're using Spring Boot Actuator here to gather some of these metrics. We have a health check here telling me I don't have a mail server, which is correct on this machine. We can see configuration information, audit information, access log information, and here we can actually dynamically change log levels of different components at runtime. Underneath the covers, they're using Swagger so we can see API information. So these are REST endpoints that have already been configured for us. And then if you're familiar with H2, we have the H2 database console. We connect to the database, and these are tables that have been created for us inside of H2. And right now my entities is empty because I have not created any. And covered this already. Okay, creating entities. This is another part where we're going to use Yeoman to create the entity, and it's actually going to step us through a number of steps to generate that entity. So JHipster is going to go in, after you run the command, yo JHipster :entity, and give it the entity name, it's going to ask you a number of questions. It will ask you circularly, do you want to add a field? Yes, the name of the field, the type of the field, validation rules, and then it's going to go back and repeat those for any additional fields that you want to add. This is an example of adding an entity inside of JHipster. Okay, after you've completed adding all the fields, it's going to optionally ask you if you want to add in another entity. I'll get through an example of that in a minute. Do you want to use a DTO? Pretty common when you're doing development inside of Spring to use a DTO to the web front end and not expose your actual entity classes. And JHipster is using a library called MapStruct, and this is something I was unfamiliar with before using JHipster, and it actually works quite nicely. And then one of the last questions it's going to ask is, do you want to use a service class for your business logic? And this is something that I prefer to use. You can use the JPA repositories directly inside of your controller, something that I don't like seeing because you usually get into additional logic there. You can generate it as a separate class, but the last option is the one that I prefer to use, where you use an interface and inject that into your class. And that's going to offer you a lot more flexibility in terms of development and testing further down the road. And the last question it's going to ask is, do you want pagination? And you actually do have a number of different options: a simple pager, pagination of links, or infinite scroll. And for each one of these options, this is going to affect how JHipster generates the code for that entity. And this is an example of the screen of finishing it out. So you can see the green area is the question, and the blue is the answers. And I'm going to take a look at the generated entity. And I got a couple projects here that I prepared for this, so I'm starting up Spring Boot on this. And then bring up Gulp as well. Now under the Entities tab, I have an option. And you can see how we're using AngularJS, Bootstrap CSS. All this is generated code by JHipster. We're going through RESTful APIs in the background, so the application does have a very nice look and feel to it. Not sure how that happened. So this is a very simple object. Let's take a look at a more complex example here. Entities with relationships. Obviously, having a flat entity is fairly boring. We don't get that lucky very often. We often get into very complex object models, and that's fully supported. And it scripts you right through it. You simply say, yes, I have a relationship to another entity. It's going to ask you the name of it, and then the type of relationship. And if you recognize these types of relationships, they look surprisingly similar to the JPA relationships. So here I'm going through the traditional book author. And the answers to all these questions affect how JHipster is going to be doing the JPA mappings under the covers. Now I have a demo of that as well. Now in this example here, I did add in some data. So I added in a little Bootstrap class. I did steal this concept directly from the Grails community. And this is something that you can hook in any Spring application, hook into the application context refresh event, and this is going to run on startup. So this application event is going to kick off on startup, and it's going to populate our database for us. So we have some data here. So I did this because I wanted you guys to see the pagination that happens. So you can see I have a list of authors now. And we're using the standard Bootstrap pagination here. You can see that we can scroll through the list. So this is all generated code through JHipster. Okay, deploying to production. JHipster has two primary profiles. One is dev, and that is for development, and that's the one that's going to be using the H2 in-memory database. And this is going to be using exploded web resources. If you're familiar with AngularJS development, it does create quite a few JavaScript resources, and before you deploy that to production, you don't want to have 1,000 JavaScript resources being downloaded by the browser. That'd be a very bad thing to do. So a common task is combine and minify those, but when you combine and minify, it makes debugging and troubleshooting difficult. So in development, you're going to be working on the raw exploded web resources, while in production you want to have a combined and minified JavaScript file and any other resources. So JHipster does support this through development, and it's going to be loading up those resources individually in the browser in a development environment. So I can show you that here. So this is all the JavaScript source files that are being pulled in that have all been generated by JHipster. And obviously this would be a very bad thing to roll into a production environment, but it makes it great for development. And this is why we have a production profile that is going to combine and minify those and build those into the WAR file for us. Now to prepare for production, we're going to do a Maven capital P prod, and that is a Maven profile that we're using, and then clean package, and that's going to generate the WAR file for us. And then to run it, this is going to be an executable WAR because of Spring Boot, and we're going to want the active profile prod. And I'm going to go over to where I've already done that at. Now, I previously ran the Maven command, so I already have that artifact there. And you can see I'm running Java -jar target war and passing in the Spring profile of prod. And this time, instead of port 9000, we're going to go to 8080. And now JHipster is up and running. This is now in Tomcat, embedded Tomcat, and it's running against a MySQL database locally on my machine. You see my test data is in there as well. Okay, what I showed you was how to use the Yeoman scripts to generate the domain classes, and that's fine for doing small things, but when you get into something more complex, you're probably going to want to use JDL, and that's JHipster domain language. And what this is, it's basically a JavaScript syntax that allows you to define the entities and their relationships. And this is important because it makes it pretty convenient where you can just completely regenerate the project, readjust the entities and their relationships, add in entities, take away entities. This is something that you're going to be commonly doing in prototyping out an application. So it would become a real pain in the neck if you had to go through the Yeoman script every time and not have this. So this is a real nice feature of JHipster. So here's an example of JPL code. And in this code, you can see we're defining an entity called employee, and we're setting up the different properties of that. Now, there's additional syntax for doing relationships and any type of constraints that you want in this. And on JHipster itself, you'd have JDL Studio, which is a graphical tool where you can actually define these and see the entities and basically an ERD on the right-hand side there. Other features of JHipster, a good practice is liquid base to manage your database deployments. Swagger, we saw an example of that while it was running. That generates API documentation for you. never want to trust a developer to do that on their own. UI tests with Karma. Performance tests, Gatling. And then good old Cucumber, for those who want to do behavior-driven development. Protractor is very popular for testing AngularJS. And then JHipster has a modules marketplace where you're getting a lot of third-party add-ons. And this is growing every day. So we're seeing more and more contributions in that area. Okay, I'd like to open things up for questions. Yes?
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Great stuff. I'd like to ask you about the structure of the project you created.
Yes.
So, as you said, you can run backend and frontend separately. And is it possible to store those sources of the project separately, different branches, whatever Git has given, so developers could, so you have different views basically, different CI from frontend and backend.
Not sure if I totally follow the question.
Okay, so
That's all right.
okay, so I'd like to separate front-end source code from the back-end source code. Can I do this?
Yes,
So there's no common part between those.
it effectively is, to be honest. But everything is built under the web app directory, and that's what Gulp is pointed at. So that's where actually everything out of the app folder. So you do have a decoupling there, so that's completely removed from that. And Gulp is like watching that and serving up those files when we're in a development mode. So it's really two different processes, and the only interaction with Tomcat when we're running that way is through an API layer.
Another one, so about the liquid base, you mentioned it. I'd like to ask you, so I understand that JHipster can create initial script for liquid base, yes?
Yes.
And can you use other tools like Fireway, for example?
I honestly don't know. I imagine you could, but probably.
And about profiles, so can you use something else than H2 or other in-memory database for that profile, like use standalone database?
Yes, you absolutely could.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? I'm sorry?
Which version of Angular JS is supported?
It's a good question. It's not 2 yet. I think they're waiting for that to become officially released. No other questions? Okay, I'd like to thank you for attending this session. My name's John Thompson. You can reach me on Twitter, this wasn't zoomed in, at @spring_guru. Or you're welcome to email me as well, and that's john@springframework.guru.